The wind moved slowly across the dry plains, carrying dust and the faint smell of sagebrush through the quiet valley. Autumn was coming, and the evenings had begun to grow cold long before the sun dipped behind the distant hills. Along a narrow dirt road that few travelers used anymore, a young woman struggled to lift a crooked plank of wood against the rough frame of a tiny shack. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and 3 weeks earlier she had stepped off a wagon believing she was about to begin a new life. She had come west as a mail-order bride. Back in St. Louis, the advertisements had promised opportunity and honest men seeking wives. Clara had been 22, newly alone after her father passed away, with no family left and very little money. When she answered the letter from a rancher named Henry Dalton, it had seemed like a miracle. His words had been polite and hopeful. He wrote that he owned land outside a small frontier town and needed a good woman to share the work and the life. He even sent money for her travel. For weeks on the wagon trail, Clara held that letter close like a promise. She imagined a little ranch house, perhaps a garden, maybe even laughter by the fire after long days of work. But when she arrived in the dusty town of Dry Creek, Henry Dalton never came. The station master told her the truth with a slow shake of his head. Dalton left months ago, he said, sold his land and rode south. No one knows where he went. Just like that, Clara's promised life vanished into the wind. At first she thought someone must be mistaken. She asked in the general store, the saloon, and the small church near the creek. Every answer was the same. Dalton had disappeared. Most people simply shrugged. Mail-order brides sometimes had bad luck on the frontier. For 2 nights, Clara slept in the corner of the church with a borrowed blanket. On the 3rd day, the preacher quietly told her the church could not keep her there forever. The town had little room for strangers who could not pay. She had considered returning east, but the stage ticket cost more money than she had left. So she made a decision. If the frontier had abandoned her, she would not abandon herself. A mile outside Dry Creek stood a patch of unused land where an old mining camp had once been. Most of the buildings had collapsed years earlier, but broken boards and beams still lay scattered among the weeds. Clara gathered them piece by piece. The first day she dragged a door across the dirt and leaned it against 2 crooked posts. The second day she found half a roof beam and balanced it on top. By the end of the week she had managed to shape a small leaning shack that barely kept out the wind. It was not much, but it was hers. Each morning she walked into town to search for scraps of work, washing laundry, sweeping porches, carrying water for the boarding house. Some people paid a few coins. Others simply closed their doors. Still, Clara refused to leave. One late afternoon, while she struggled to hammer a bent nail into a warped board, the sound of hoofbeats rolled across the dry road behind her. She paused. Travelers rarely came this way. When she turned, she saw a tall cowboy riding a dark horse slowly toward the shack. Dust clung to his boots, and the brim of his hat cast a shadow across his eyes. He reined the horse to a stop several yards away and studied the crooked structure. Then he looked at her. Clara straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. Afternoon. The cowboy nodded slightly. His voice was deep but calm. "You building that yourself?" Clara hesitated, unsure if he was mocking her. "Yes," she said. He glanced at the slanted roof and the uneven walls. "Looks like it's trying its best not to fall over." Clara folded her arms defensively. "It hasn't fallen yet." For a moment the cowboy said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he swung down from the saddle. He walked toward the shack slowly, examining the frame with the careful eye of someone who understood wood and weight. "You put this beam backwards," he said after a moment. That's why the wall keeps leaning." Clara frowned. It was the only way it would fit. Not quite. Without another word he lifted the beam, turned it, and slid it back into place. The structure immediately looked steadier. Clara blinked in surprise. The cowboy stepped back and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Name's Daniel Carter," he said. "My ranch is 2 miles north." Clara hesitated before answering. "Clara Whitmore." Daniel nodded. "Mind if I fix a few things?" She stared at him, unsure what to say. "Why?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked at the small shack, then at the scattered boards lying in the weeds. "Because," he said simply, "no one should have to live in a place that falls apart in the first strong wind." Before Clara could respond, he walked back to his horse and untied a coil of rope and a small tool bag from the saddle. For the next 2 hours Daniel worked. He straightened the frame, replaced weak boards, and secured the roof with careful knots. Clara found herself helping, holding planks, passing nails, steadying beams. Neither of them spoke much. But as the sun began to sink behind the hills, the shack looked different. Still small, still rough, but solid. Daniel stepped back and examined it with a satisfied nod. "That'll hold," he said. Clara stared at the tiny house in disbelief. It looked better than anything she could have built alone. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel shrugged. "Just needed a little balance." He climbed back onto his horse and tipped his hat. "Take care, Miss Whitmore." Then he rode away. Clara watched until he disappeared beyond the dusty ridge. The next morning she woke early to the sound of hoofbeats again. When she stepped outside, Daniel Carter was there. This time he had a small bundle tied behind his saddle. "Morning," he said. Clara blinked in surprise. "Morning." Daniel tossed the bundle gently toward her. Inside were a blanket, a loaf of bread, and a small tin of coffee. "You looked like you might need these," he said. Clara's throat tightened. "You didn't have to do that." "Maybe not," Daniel replied, "but I did." From that day forward, Daniel began stopping by the shack every few evenings. Sometimes he brought leftover food from the ranch. Sometimes he helped strengthen another wall or repair a loose board. Clara slowly learned that Daniel lived alone on a modest cattle ranch he had inherited from his father. He worked long days and rarely came into town unless supplies were needed. He was quiet, thoughtful, and strangely gentle for a man who spent most of his life riding across rough land. One evening, while they sat outside the shack watching the sky turn orange, Daniel finally asked the question he had been holding back. "How'd you end up out here alone?" Clara hesitated, but something about Daniel's calm presence made the truth easier to speak. She told him everything: the letter, the journey west, the empty promise waiting in Dry Creek. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stared out across the fields for a long moment. "That man's a fool," he said quietly. Clara gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe." Daniel shook his head. "No maybe about it." Days turned into weeks. Winter crept slowly across the plains, bringing colder winds and longer nights. But Clara's shack stayed warm thanks to the small stove Daniel helped install. One evening he arrived carrying a stack of sturdy lumber in his wagon. Clara raised an eyebrow. "What's that for?" Daniel leaned against the wagon. "Figured your house deserves real walls." Clara laughed softly. "This is already more than I expected." Daniel met her eyes. "Still," he said gently, "you deserve better." For the next several days they worked side by side, expanding the little shack into a proper cabin. They built stronger walls, added a window, and patched the roof with new boards. By the time the first snow dusted the hills, Clara no longer lived in a broken shelter. She lived in a small but sturdy home. One quiet night, as the fire crackled inside the cabin, Clara looked across the table at Daniel. "You know," she said softly, You changed my whole life." Daniel shook his head. "You changed it yourself." She smiled. "But you saw me." Daniel held her gaze for a moment. Out on the frontier, where loneliness stretched wider than the open plains, sometimes the greatest act of kindness was simply noticing someone who had been forgotten. And that simple act had turned a broken beginning into something neither of them had expected, something stronger, something real. Outside, the winter wind swept across the valley, but inside the small cabin, a new story had quietly begun.